All right, it is 22, so some other people may join. We were expecting a few more folks, but they might be running a bit late or be load shed. Welcome, Titi, and let's not kind of beat around the bush anymore. Jill, would you like to introduce the special interest group, or would you like me to?
Sarah, go ahead.
All right. So for those of you who don't know, this is a very young but growing community of people who are interested in education issues, not just in South Africa, but in the Southern African region. And most of us share a connection through, at some point, being involved in the Callan Collins network, either as scholars or as alumni or as kind of associates of some type or form. And what we really wanted to do was we wanted to get in people with expertise and knowledge around issues that people really want answers to come and talk to us, preferably in an accessible format. Of course, what that means is very different. And one of the questions that came up early in our WhatsApp group was questions around the relationship between early literacy and success at school. Of course, success being quite a political thing to define. So I couldn't help it. I had to say, I know someone who knows this stuff in her bones. And that is soon to be Dr. Xolisa Guzula, who is a very dear friend of mine and who I love with all my heart, and who I think just cannot be beaten for knowledge about decolonized and emancipatory approaches to thinking about early childhood literacy. So I learned Xhosa through Polly at the Bilingualism reading clubs 12 plus years ago. And I don't think I appreciated when I first met her what a powerhouse she is, what a phenomenal teacher she is, what a phenomenal mentor she is, what a prolific translator, and just an absolute beacon flying the flag for children to be able to be literate in the languages they know, and to read for fun, and to read for meaning, and to read for joy. So I can't sing her praises enough. She will be too humble to say half the things she deserves herself. But I would love to hand over the floor to Dr. Xolisa Guzula, who's going to tell us a little bit more about her work and how we can all, as education people, understand the role of language and literacy in what we do. Polly.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for that beautiful introduction. Yeah, sometimes you listen and you think, is that me? So thank you very much. I'm happy to share what I am going to talk about. My experience, Sarah said to me, this is informal, but of course I made it formal so it can be semi-formal because I have my PowerPoint presentation, but also we can have, you can stop me at any point if you have a question, and then we can have a discussion. I was talking to Sarah earlier. Can you see my slide, my full slide? So I was talking to Sarah earlier about the work we were doing in reading clubs, and she mentioned earlier the Vulindlela Reading Club, which we started in 2006 in Langa Township. And at the time when we started the Vulindlela Reading Club, we were, before that, we were working in schools as teacher trainers, some of us. And in the schools, we were told that we should stop working. You know how NGOs come into schools and work and confuse teachers because teachers have to implement the curriculum, and you come as NGOs with your ideas, and you kind of, there's no space in the classroom for the teacher to do all these wonderful ideas you bring. And this wonderful idea that we were bringing at the time was that we understand that children have to learn their grammar, their syntax, they have to learn their phonics in the foundation phase, like letter sound, relationships. And so they have to learn that, we understand. But we were saying there's something missing, that these children are not being exposed to reading itself. They are learning language as a technical skill, and they're not learning it in a fun way where they get immersed in stories that are imaginative, that also will spark imagination in them, so that they produce also imaginative stories. And also we know the value of we knew the value of storytelling in Africa, but also the value of reading bedtime stories to children, of which some of the children that we were working with had no access to. So when they go to school, they only learn languages if it's just a technical skill and not have access to the real books or to reading role models who will read to them so that they then become interested in books and also want to read to others. So that was the one thing that we started. So, but the children in Langa, of course, there's this assumption that we have monolingual townships or monolingual villages, right? So the assumption is that the children in Langa are only Xhosa speaking. And then they learn English at school. And that, therefore, the club was going to be, we were already working on bilingual education at the time, but the kind of bilingual education that we were influenced by was the one where you strengthen the mother tongue, and then you build enough foundation for children to be able to learn English, right? So it was kind of sequential. So you start by strengthening the mother tongue, and then you build, English based on the mother tongue. But things changed, as Sarah would attest, in that the children who came to the reading club weren't only Xhosa speaking. They were Xhosa and English speaking. Some were bilingual by themselves, like they were bilingual in Xhosa and English, but some were attending schools in the townships where isiXhosa is used the most, but that doesn't mean that they don't know English. And some were attending schools in model schools, and they were stronger in English. So at the time when we were saying, okay, we will have a Xhosa week, and then you discover that in your group, the children who go to model schools are stronger in English. So when you have the Xhosa week, they're kind of subdued or feel neglected because you are focusing on the ones who raise their hands, and the ones who raise their hands are like stronger in isiXhosa. And the following week, you see the same thing happening. So when you do everything in English, those who know English well enough will raise their hands and communicate. And then those who speak more of isiXhosa will be kind of subdued and also feel like they are neglected. So then we had volunteers like Sarah and others. Sarah luckily was already speaking isiXhosa when she came, but she strengthened it by coming to the club. But the other facilitators didn't know isiXhosa, so they couldn't speak isiXhosa. And so there was a moment where we felt like we are missing out on the resources that these facilitators are bringing when we have a Xhosa week and we don't use them. Sometimes there would be one facilitator who's Xhosa speaking and the rest would be English. So what do you do in that situation? And also, what do you do in a situation where you have more books in English than there are books in isiXhosa? So those are the things that we grappled with while we were working practically. And then we ended up developing this bilingual pedagogy in the club where we decided to use all languages simultaneously, in the club. So Sarah could tell a story in English, I could translate it into Xhosa, or the children would do that themselves. And that was, and also vice versa. And then children started growing their bilingualism. But of course, we're not researching it. We were learning from the ground and seeing how language works, so that when we challenge policies, we have on the ground experience of how these things can happen and what has been tried out. So today, I'm presenting to you, so my title is Constructing Pedagogical Third Spaces that Promote Simultaneous Biliteracy Development. So you can see I'm talking about learning languages simultaneously rather than sequentially or in a hierarchical order. So it's just not just language, but also literacy. So I'm going to talk about what third spaces are, because the club that we started in Langa was a third space, because it's a third space because at home, the children learn, maybe there's home literacies and then there's school literacies. And sometimes there's this binary, between home literacies and school literacies. So we wanted to find a way in between where we could nurture the children. So As I go through the presentation, you must remember these things that I've just mentioned earlier, because I just couldn't go on without mentioning how Sarah and others were instrumental in the startup of the reading clubs. But this is a separate reading club, and it's called the Stars of Today Literacy Club, which then I started in 2015. We started in 2015 as part of my PhD study. So I'm presenting to you an aspect of my PhD, a tiny aspect of my PhD that I'm thinking about also just writing a paper on, because this aspect is important to me in showing also how, for example, somebody who is not, who doesn't share the same linguistic resources as the children, but who has a multilingual orientation, can make things happen for the children and can create a liberating environment for children to learn, even though the person cannot speak or doesn't have the same linguistic resources with the children. So you will hear more about that. So in terms of language learning, the current thinking in the country is that I think I'm going to have to explain to you what subjective and additive approaches to bilingualism are. But the current thinking in education is that people have a monolingual orientation in how they conceptualize language. So they see languages as separate for the bilinguals. So they see them as home language and as first additional language, right? But bilinguals, in my view, don't separate their languages. They have them and they use them simultaneously all the time. But I'm saying that this conceptualization happens in both subjective and additive approaches. So the subjective approach to bilingual education is the current one, that the approach that the teachers are using, but it comes from apartheid, where the children learn in the mother tongue for first 3 years, and then they switch over to English in grade 4. So what happens is that the mother tongue is used for the first 3 years. Then English takes over and the mother tongue is removed. So it's called subjective bilingualism. And then additive bilingualism came with a policy that came post-apartheid. This policy was trying to address the imbalances of the past, where the mother tongues were not used in education, to say they must start being used in education. So instead of having a subjective approach where you remove the mother tongue, you still carry on with it in grade 4, 5, 6, 7, but you add on English as another medium of instruction, in a way that you could have a dual medium kind of education where you use 2 languages for teaching the children. And of course, this comes from the way in which teachers teach children in school, that when the children don't understand, the teachers will switch to isiXhosa, isiZulu, isiSotho to ensure that the children understand. So that policy was building on what was happening on the ground. So, but we still have this monolingual orientation that says start with one language and add another later, and that it is a first additional language. And then these languages are supposed to be taught in silos separately. They mustn't mix. So if a child mixes isiXhosa in an English period, that child will be punished. Same if she mixes in English in a isiXhosa period, the child would be punished or penalized, and that they can't write in 2 languages as well. So then they get penalized if they do. Even if the answer is correct, they will be penalized. So this all stems, of course, from the Eurocentric nation state ideologies. We know that when the formation of the nation states in Europe, was happening, one nation, one language had to become the ideology. So we have Britain with English, we have France with French, we have Portugal with Portuguese, and so on and so on. So when the Dutch and the English came and colonized South Africa, then the ideologies of one language, one nation, one language stayed with them, right? So we know that in history, for example, there was a Dutchification period where the Dutch wanted everybody to just learn Dutch and be Dutch, you know. And then we also know that there was an Anglicization period around the 1900s. In the late 1800s to the early 1900s, we know that the English also did the same. They wanted to Anglicize everybody, including the Dutch, who were now changing to become Afrikaners. And so, and there was that battle, of course, that was tied up with the Anglo-Boer War. So the language issues were also part of that. One language seeking to dominate others. That's what a Eurocentric ideology around language, a monolingual ideology around language is about. So Dutch at first wanted to take over Afrikaans, and then English also wanted to take over, wanted to take over everybody, and then the English wanted to do the same. So we always say the battle of language in South Africa is the battle of the Afrikaners and the English. And then of course, this ignores African multilingualisms, or what is called indigenous multilingualism, that in Africa, we are multilingual, and yet we have to apply the nation state ideology of Europe of saying one language for education. Yet we are a multilingual continent and a multilingual country, and that people speak more than one language in South Africa, and that more than one language might not be English as well. You might be multilingual in African languages, and that often gets erased in favor of African language English multilingual, bilingualism. But if you are multilingual in African languages, you're not valued enough. You must be multilingual also in English. That also ignores multilinguality of African languages, or the fact that African languages like English have got varieties. We know in English that we have British English, we have Australian English, we have American English, we have South African English, we have Pidgin English, then we have what people call Black English or Indian English. You know, we have those, the varieties of English. So we have many Englishes in the world. Same with African languages. We have many Xhosas, or many within E-SIG Xhosa, there are dialect and varieties, so that we have what is called the PE Xhosa or the Gugulethu Xhosa, but also like what we call urban varieties, basically. But we also have the dialects such as isiBhaca, isimpondo, isiHlubi, and people claim those. They say they are not Xhosa, they are amaHlubi, you know, they are a nation of their own, but they had been subsumed under the Xhosa with the standardization of language. And of course, that standardization of languages made sure that other dialects would be marginalized in favor of the dialect of the kings, of the Tsalega and amaHachabe, which then got to be standardized. So those people whose dialects were marginalized are still not happy that their languages are not developed or used. So in that sense, multilingualism gets multiplied by the varieties of the languages that are there. Currently, bilingualism, therefore, is seen as two monolingualisms in one's head. So as you have your home language, and then you have English, and that you must switch off the other when you speak the other. And as such, this creates a deficit view of those who mix languages. So if you mix a language in a Xhosa class, then you would be called semi-lingual, that you're not good in Xhosa and you're not good in English because you are mixing your languages. That's the current thinking around language. And then we also have current thinking around literacy in the country, that we have to have these monolingual literacies in the home language and in the first additional language. And most recently, we've had a framework for teaching reading in African languages, which now separates almost like teaching reading in African languages, and then there's teaching reading in English. And that kind of also monolingualizes literacy learning in the classroom. And we also see that reading has taken over to mean literacy in the country. So when we talk of literacy, people talk about reading. So South African children cannot read in any language, but no writing is mentioned. No other forms of expression are being mentioned as part of being literate. So reading and as such becomes seen as an important skill, especially decoding, working with the letter sounds, your ABCs and the sounds of those ABCs, and letter sound correspondence. That's what teachers are having to teach. And that's the first skill that is being pushed forward as a skill that needs to be taught first. We also see that reading in South Africa is seen as book reading. So if people don't read books, they're not seen as readers. And this is strange because I don't know if people have seen the book called The Nation's Bounty that Jeff Opland put together, and it's this thick. That book is poetry that was written in newspapers in the early in 1900s by Nonfiction. Nonfiction was a poet, a female poet. She wrote her poetry in newspapers. And because at the time, Black people didn't have money to publish books in publishing houses, but they had the printing presses for newspapers. So that's how literature made itself into to the community through the newspapers. But we see that in our schooling, literacy is seen as you being able to read from a book, and also neglecting, of course, other literacies that are there. And of course, we know that now these phonics that are being taught need to be supported by strategies such as shared reading, group guided reading, and then comprehension is the end goal. So you start with the sounds, you build them up nicely, you build words, you decode words, you encode words, and then you come to comprehension later. And this is what is happening in the country. Now we're having many reading interventions that emphasize this. And there's a new thing now about the science of reading, which actually puts forward decoding and comprehension as what needs to be taught in schools. And of course, to the, people forget that writing needs to happen simultaneously with reading. So it's ignored completely. And we know it becomes a challenge for many of us coming to university if you have not been socialized into writing much earlier on. And then, of course, as you can see in my column on the right, is that the bilingual literacies and the multilingual literacies are ignored. There was a model of reading that was developed by Luke and Freebody called the 4 resources model. It has 4 quadrants. In the first 2 quadrants, you see decoding and meaning making, which is what is focused on in the left column in South Africa. But what is left behind is the other 2 quadrants, the one that focuses on text production, whether it's printed text or multimodal text or digital texts in literacy, and also analysis of texts like critical literacy is ignored. So what you see, the 4 resources model kind of expands literacy and it broadens it, whereas the science of reading kind of narrows it down to reading, to decoding and comprehension. Of course, multiliteracies and multimodal literacies like that include oral and performative literacies are also ignored, like the arts, the music, the storytelling, which are critical aspects of being literate, are also ignored in the South African education system. So we have now narrow literacies, and reading stands for literacy, as we can see from our conceptualization in the country. So for my work, therefore, I decided to draw on the theory of third spaces. Third spaces, which Baba, Anzaldua, Soja, and Gutierrez write about, as spaces in between and beyond 2 binaries. conceptualization and discourses that are often thought as separate and uncombinable. So combining those things that are thought of as uncombinable. So if you combine two languages in a space, you know, that's the theory allows me to do that rather than to separate them in neat spaces of home language and first additional language. So you bring the two together in one, because bilinguals don't separate their languages. They use two or more languages simultaneously in their daily life. Then there's a notion of third spaces as established spaces, and a notion of third spaces as adaptive third spaces. Currently in our education system, we have the adaptive third spaces, where a teacher will translate something to children into isiXhosa because the children don't understand, but the teacher comes back to English as a main medium of instruction. But established third spaces actually legitimize and authorize use of more than one language or mode of teaching literacy. And also in the space, I could bring in both social literacies, social practice literacies, like how we use literacy in our daily life, like writing emails, writing letters, writing messages, birthday cards, those social literacies and pedagogized literacies, and bringing them together. So the third space allows me to do that. So those binaries, therefore, of home, school, home, English, Xhosa, standard, non-standard, reading and writing, monomodal, multimodal, you actually get to close them when you use the theory of third spaces. So such that you have hybrid communication practices and hybrid modes of communication. So some people call them linguistic third spaces because now you're creating a third space to say bilinguals do not function, do not use language in the same way as monolinguals. They have the way of bringing all their language resources for meaning making in the space. So we know that Kanagaraja writes about translingual practices. Translingual practices speak more. There's translanguaging, but there's also translingual practices. They speak more to how children can write in two languages. They focus on writing. Of course, this is the kind of writing that teachers frown upon because they do not like it. But you know, bilingual children can write in two languages simultaneously. So that's what the theory allows me to do. Translingual third spaces also and translanguaging are about use of more than one linguistic resource for communication, like the students do on campus when they speak to each other in isiZulu, isiXhosa, English, and Sesotho, mixing the languages. This is a space that authorizes the children to use the language in the way that they use it. So how does this bring me to simultaneous biliteracy? Of course, when you have children using different languages and different modes of communication, you could actually have these two languages or more. But I'm saying two because in Cape Town, it's assumed that in the townships, children have English, and then they, sorry, it's Xhosa, and then they learn English. So you bring the two, but also you bring them in one space, in a third space, but you could also have a planned alternation of language and a spontaneous use of language. So in a planned use of language, you could say Sarah is going to tell a story in English and Xoli is going to retell it in isiXhosa. Okay, that's a planned thing. But what happens in the process of the telling of the story is seen as spontaneous, because I could be drawing on both English and isiXhosa in telling Sarah's story. So people write about that. And also they use, so also what happens, I know people do get worried when you talk about translanguaging, because they say, when are you going to develop isiXhosa for its own sake? And when are you going to develop English for its own sake? And of course, that's important for marginalized languages to be developed. So sometimes, yes, if in a third space, in a translanguaging space, you can name languages and so say English and isiXhosa because you want to make them visible. You want to make isiXhosa visible in a space that isiXhosa is marginalized, or isiZulu or isiSotho is marginalized. So you name it because you want to make it visible. But sometimes you focus on the linguistic repertoire where you don't name the language because it's so intertwined that you don't know where isiXhosa begins and where English starts, because the person uses both or more languages simultaneously. So why this approach? This approach for me is to challenge the monolingual ideologies of nation states. And of course, of curriculum writers in South Africa are usually white and English speaking. So they bring their language ideologies into the writing of the curriculum. So since we know that the English students tend to see themselves, or the English tend to see themselves as monolingual, and then learn Afrikaans in school as a second language, or the Africans are monolingual Afrikaans, and then they will learn English at school as a second language. And that gets applied to everybody, even though many Black children in the country can speak more than one language before they come to school. And so that separation of language doesn't really work for them. It is to enable children to draw on their diverse sociocultural resources to facilitate biliteracy and to calibrate education of bilinguals on their existing language resources rather than on something that doesn't really exist, and to transcend the home language and first additional language binaries because these have a monolingual orientation. So I'm going to show you briefly to show how this has happened in the literacy club where I worked. The children wrote the name of their club on the board, and they called it Stars of Today Literacy Club hashtag. So that's why the hashtag always comes at the end of the word rather than at the beginning of the word, because this is how the children wrote it. And so the club took place in Khayelitsha in 2015 until I handed it over in 2018 at the school. So for those years, 2015 to 2018, I was part of the lead facilitators of the club because this is where I was going to do my literacy club. I had, it was taking place on Saturday between 10 and 12, like the Langa one. We had 40 to 60 children a week because these are the children who were invited, but they were not coming regularly to the club because it was voluntary, but we had permissions from their parents that they could come. So when there's free space at home, they could be encouraged to come. Then we had bilingual teachers, facilitators, teacher trainers, students, and artists. So some people were bilingual English Afrikaans, some were bilingual isiXhosa English, and some were artists who could do visual art with children, and also some performative, arts, creative arts with children. And of course, it had to be a bilingual and multimodal literacy club because it was transcending the binaries of one mode and one language. We focused on songs and games and storytelling, reading, art and writing, performative poetry and drama to promote literacy. The data collection was I was using linguistic ethnography. As some or most of you would know, ethnography is more about being in the space, almost as if you are living there with the people in the community and understanding their ways of seeing the world from their perspective. And so with linguistic ethnography, it involves how people in that community use language in their everyday life, and how I was going to interpret the data from their perspective. And so I used linguistic ethnographic tools such as photographs, video recordings, and field notes. Lots of photographs were taken, and video recordings and audio recordings were transcribed. So I have like huge data of the literacy club. But also one thing that I didn't mention to you is that the literacy club also had a holiday program. So as soon as the schools were closing in the week they were closing for March, June, and September, then we would have a 3-day holiday program where we would run on 3 consecutive days to have the club and have full-on activities on arts and language and literacy happening together. So, and then of course, with this part that I'm presenting, so the theoretical concept of linguistic resources, linguistic repertoires, linguistic third spaces, and translanguaging are used to talk about the data and also the multimodal semiotic analysis. So I want to tell you about the part of the holiday program that we had as a club, where we had a planned translanguaging, because now, facilitators are doing the plan for the holiday program and who's gonna do what, in what language, so being aware of the languages that are being spoken. And so on day 1, I was to tell the story, not to read it from a book, but to tell the story in isiXhosa, a story of the boy and the drum that has a monster in it. And then the children were going to retell the story in English using shared writing. And they were going to retell the story with Marlene Rousseau, who had, I have permission to mention her name and her work in honor of her work that she did in the Literacy Club. She was an English Afrikaans bilingual. So she didn't have shared linguistic resources with the children in terms of isiXhosa. So she was going to do this shared writing, and shared writing is a process where teachers ask the children to tell them the story and the teacher scribes it for them. So the child will tell 1 line at a time and then you scribe it down for them. And it's got many, shared writing is actually a way of teaching children how to write, demonstrating how to write from left to right, from top to bottom, when to put capital letters and full stops when you write. And so whoever does that will discuss those language issues with the children. So, and then of course, they after retelling the story, they had to draw their monsters, because they had to visualize the monsters as I was telling the story of the monster, and then they had to draw their monsters. On day 2, we displayed the monster and the children had a gallery walk to look at each other's monsters. And then they also did a role play about monsters, and they had to pretend to be, monsters, and they could choose a language that they wanted to use for their role play. But also other stories of monsters were read in isiXhosa and in English. So you can see how the planning separates and names the languages. Of course, in day 3, we discussed the artwork, we discussed the monsters that were done by the children and how the monsters became also in the role play and in the artwork. And we asked children the question of whether the monsters have always been mean, ugly, and scary, because that came up in the discussion. And then they had to retell the story of the monster in writing. And of course, but I'm only telling about the day 1. Also the aspect, not the aspect of the drawing of the monster, but the aspect of the retelling of the story of the monster that was supposed to be in English. So I told the story in isiXhosa, and this is the library. And in the library, you can also bring in, that's a funny thing, the classroom in the library, as again, transcending the spaces, physical spaces, and creating third spaces, physical third spaces. So we had the newsprint and a board, and Marlene had a cookie, and she was taking the retelling of the story from the children, and they were supposed to do it in English. So, and so of course, Marlene writes as the children say, and she says the words as the children say them. I don't know if you want me to make this bigger. Can you see? Okay, if you can see. So Marlene, of course, says, didn't believe the boy. Of course, you are writing, so you're saying the words as you are writing. And full stop, of course. That's the purpose of shared writing, because you have to say and think aloud as you are doing it. And so then, and then she says, aha, and what happened then? Yes, my dear. And the child says, another child, oh, sorry, this is now me telling another child whispers something quickly to Marlene. She says, u-auntie, u-auntie. And then ke ngoku u-auntie wahamba wayoxelela ulantuka abazali benkwenkwe ukubana inkwenkwe ayithumeki. So Marlene says, I'd like someone to come and sit next to me just so that they can write isiXhosa. So what Marlene does here is different from so many classrooms, where the teacher will either say, translate what she has said into English or speak English, because we are doing this activity in English. So in many classrooms, teachers say that, no, we speak English. Try to speak English because we are doing this activity in English. Or they say, can we translate what she's just said in English? Sorry, into isiXhosa. But she is not saying that. She is saying, can someone come and write for me in isiXhosa? And so a child raises their hand and Marlene says, are you going to write for us? And then as one of the facilitators in the group, I say, ngesiXhosa, uzokwazi ubhala ngesiXhosa. Anyone can go. Do you want to go and write next to Marlene? So you can see, again, I'm using both isiXhosa and English in speaking. And then, and I'm saying, you're going to write in isiXhosa because Marlene has asked for isiXhosa. So when he goes to the front to write on the whiteboard, and then I say, uzobhala le nto ibithethwa ngesiXhosa ne? Well, he says, okay. So he writes on the board. And I say, yeah, it's okay. Then a child says, ngesiXhosa okanye ngesingesi. So the child who had given the latest answer goes to sit beside Welile to help him. And then they start saying what he was saying, umakazi. Remember he said u-auntie. So they are translating that to umakazi. And Weli continues to write on the board. And Marlene says, so I'm learning Xhosa. What is inkwenkwe? And the children say, the boy. Marlene says, the boy. Ah, thank you. So Weli continues to write on the whiteboard with assistance from the girl. And Marlene says, thank you very much. Okay, sweetheart. And then they go back. And of course, this shared writing also happens. It continues because it's not just one sentence that was given, it's many other sentences. And we can see the children going up and inserting their writing in isiXhosa, even though it's supposed to be an English shared writing. And of course, after isiXhosa, another child will offers a response in English. So there are English sentences and Xhosa sentences in this one activity. So, and of course, it continues there, as you can see from the transcript, that there is isiXhosa and English going on in the communication, in the which we would call the spontaneous translanguaging within that blend translanguaging that was supposed to happen. So I want to draw your attention to the end part where it says children and Marlene. I've made it bigger here. So the text has become one linguistic repertoire. So Marlene says, okay, above, monster, beautiful. Then they saw the shadow, big monster. Okay, can we read it? Can we go right back to the start and read it together? Okay, let's read it. And so they start reading. The boy always played his drum. The small auntie didn't like his drum. One day, the small auntie asked the boy to go to the forest to get some fruit. But the boy said, no, there's a ghost in the forest. The auntie didn't believe the boy. Umakazi wahamba wayoxelela abazali benkwenkwe. Abazali inkwenkwe ayithumeki. Utata wenkwenkwe wathi masihambeni sonke. The boy took the drum and put it in the branches. The mother, the father, and the auntie and the boy started picking the fruit. Then they saw the shadow of the big monster. Of course, this is still halfway through the retelling of the story. there's still in the transcript more that's going on and the children telling the story. And so it gets to become a Xhosa and English text in the end. And you can see the children's writing is smaller within that text. So this is what we call the one linguistic repertoire, where you don't name the languages because it is written bilingually. It is one text that is written. It's a single repertoire. But of course, for those people who say, but if you let children mix like this, when are they ever going to separate the languages if you do it this way? So I argue that, of course, through translation, the bilingual text can be, the languages can be named again and worked on if the goal is the production of monolingual text. So you can say, can we turn this text into English only? Can we engage in some translation of those isiXhosa sentences so that we make it English only? Or can we engage in the translation of the English sentences and make them isiXhosa so that we have an isiXhosa text? So in the end, you could have three texts, the bilingual text, the isiXhosa text, and the English text. So this is basically what I have been doing at the club with the children. So I argue that facilitators or teachers who do not share children's linguistic resources can, with a bilingual or multilingual orientation, promote children's simultaneous biliteracy development. They do not have to tell the children to speak one language, but they can find strategies of working with and across the different language resources the children have. Children's linguistic resources enable them to make meaning, to participate and communicate in learning spaces. Through reflection on action, monolingual activities can be transformed into bi-multilingual activities if the goal is to be inclusive and promote participation and meaning making. That bilingual text can be a starting point sometimes, and that translation can facilitate the separation into monolingual text if that is the goal, but also bilingual text can remain bilingual if that is the goal. So it depends on the people and how they want to do with the different linguistic resources that are available in the classroom. So I will stop there. I've taken so long, but I do hope that yeah, I've given you a clue into the work on bilingual and multilingual education that I do, especially in literacies.
Thank you so much, Sis Polly. I mean, I haven't actually seen a lot of this empirical work, and it's really amazing how you kind of putting this practice that I've seen you do in person and making it like connect with the broader idea around what we value and what we're aiming for and what we take literacy to mean. I've never seen you kind of frame it like that. I was wondering if you could just, I mean, this is a bit of a question with me kind of wanting you to maybe give us a little bit of context about, you know, what is the state of literacy with this monolingual ideology you describe that's been the dominant curriculum approach in our schooling system? What is the effect of that on early literacy and language use for children, and how is that affecting their experience of schooling from the get-go? Could you just give people a little bit of a taste about that broader context as well?
Okay, so with the monolingual orientation to literacy, so what happens is that, so when children are expected to use one language in class, but they know the answer and can say it in the other language, they start feeling that they are inadequate, or they are being made to feel that they are inadequate when they can express what they know and can express it in another language, because they are being restricted to the silos that are created in the classroom. And so this has also made a lot of the children feel there's this deficit view of them, which is the biggest thing, is the deficit view of South African children as not being able to read and write in any of their languages. that's what we hear, especially from larger assessments like the PELS, and now we know also the EGRS, the early grade reading studies that are carried out, which are, of course, both PELS and the early grade reading studies are assessments that have been imported from the USA and are applied in South Africa to test literacy. So what happens first is the tests have to be monolingual. So you take bilingual children and you try to make them monolingual, and they have to read the whole text in one language. And then when they can't respond in one language, because for them language use means using all the resources that they know, it means that now they are unable to answer the text monolingually. Secondly, what that means also is that they are not only monolingual, but also monoglossic, the focus on standard languages. So some children, I mean, there's a lot of data here that shows children talking about the monster as, so they were discussing the monster and the children were saying, monster, what did it look like? And because they had seen their artwork when they were doing the gallery walk. So some says, amanye are red, amazim. Amanye are red, amanye are green, you know? And so, and again, people tend to think that when the children say are green or are red, that they don't know isiXhosa, they don't know it. So one of the strategies that we use in the literacy club is to say, okay, what is another way of saying are red? And the children say, I'm above, you know. What is another way of saying are green? And they say aluhlaza. So in the data, I have this whole transcript where the children translate from their variety to the standard language. And so, but assessments are always standardized. So children only have to know the standard language. So the non-standard varieties therefore are seen as inferior. And if the child were to write a red in an assessment, they would get it, the answer wrong, even if, I mean, the answer is right, but they would get it wrong because they use the wrong language. So we can see the effects of this also in the PELS assessments, because we know that PELS also assesses nonfiction, okay? And so if children don't have access to nonfiction books, for example, here we're talking about fiction, so it's a story fiction. It assesses fiction and nonfiction. So if children don't have access to nonfiction books in their languages, then the children will struggle to understand the language that is used and the way in which it is used. So which is why that text user quadrant, which is not valued in the conceptualization of language, like text production or text user is both production and user, right? Text user and text production. So children need to be able to know how to use texts of different genres. And if they are not being able to use them, then they struggle. So now in an assessment, they've never been used to using text or production of text, and now they're given a text that is nonfiction and they have to know how to use it, and they don't know how to use it. And so that becomes a struggle for the children and they fail their assessments. Another thing that is also happening is that these texts, these nonfiction texts are translatable. So Xolisa is a translator, can translate the exam, right? The assessment from English to isiXhosa. But the assessments come from different countries, right? So children are not writing the same script. So some of the South African texts, sorry, there are people talking. So some of the texts come from, like the scripts come from South Africa, but some will come from another country. So a child can either get a script that comes from the UK or from, you know, USA in their test, because they are not writing the same test, like same story, but it's testing the same, it's testing the same skills, right? And so what happens is that if a child gets a text about anything, let's say you're talking about mountains and and canyons, or you get a text about coral reef, which got translated into Xhosa, but the children have never seen that, and they have never read a text about that. They don't even know what that means. And so therefore that affects their understanding of the whole text, because it's foreign, the whole thing. It's not relevant, it's not what they do every day. So which is why we talk about drawing on children's socio-cultural resources to teach them, rather than only using foreign texts, because then what you teach is not relevant to their lives. And that matters if we are getting young children to be literate, to bring some of what they know and to take them from what they know to what they don't know. So I think that creates a deficit, not only of the children, it creates a deficit also of the teachers. Yeah. So we have so many teachers in South Africa now who are seen as not being able to teach reading and writing. And also I argue in my thesis, not only the teachers and the children, but their lecturers who do not subscribe to the science of reading, theoretical perspective, because then they have to be told that they're not teaching literacy properly to the teachers that they train, and they have to be retrained by those who hold that view. So those are the issues that we are facing in the country.
Yeah, I mean, also as a maths teacher, you just look at the results, and the children who are learning in languages that they understand perform 20 to 30% better at mathematics than the children who are learning in a language that is just completely divorced from what they do at home. So it rips through the curriculum, it rips through meaning making across all learning areas and knowledge areas. So it's not just about sort of the arts or language itself, but if you look at how students from grade 3 onwards, their mathematics as well, the differential between students who are English or Afrikaans speaking and their maths attainment, it's enormous. We've got some questions. Exactly. Yeah, we've got some questions in the chat, but I think it's even nicer to offer Sistoli questions verbally. Jill, would you mind actually just unmuting yourself and asking? And anyone else too, just raise your hand and we'll queue you up.
Sarah, I'm aware of time, so I don't want to take too much time, because I think I don't know what people's time limits are like. But this is, Xolisa, I thought it was just fascinating, and I really loved the way you illustrated so clearly, quite dense theory in such beautiful, clear practice. So that was really, I congratulate you for that. I'm really interested in not only the idea of sort of languages literacy, but also how music and art and drama as other literacies and the implications of your work for that, and just how sort of undervalued or marginalized music and art are in the classroom or learning spaces, and how your work can inform, those challenges that people are grappling with. So that was the one thing. And the other thing was just how do you take this further? How do you inspire teachers to not feel such sort of deficit, but to just see the joy and the space and the potential for this kind of methodology in their practice? I don't know, that's a big question, but those were the kinds of questions that came to mind while you were talking. Yeah, thank you. It was a fantastic presentation, really inspiring work.
Thank you. Thank you, Gillian. I think I'll start with your second question about how do we take this further. Part of the work that we've been doing in literacy, those people who think they know literacy, but to bring in other people who are not literacy trainers or teachers and bring them together. So there may be parents who need to know about this, because parents also need to be informed about how they could help their children. And so they learn by coming to clubs like this. and becoming facilitators in the club. And also you bring in teachers. So by involving them, you offer a different kind of training for the teacher that is not hierarchical, that is not telling them that they don't know. They are facilitators like you in the club. And so blurring those lines between the teacher trainer and the teacher and working together in the space, and each one being a facilitator of a group. So sometimes it might be a teacher who tells a story. Sometimes it might be me who tells a story. Sometimes a child telling a story, or another facilitator who's a musician who tells a story. So everybody starts at an equal level of being a facilitator in the literacy club and also a learner. So in this club, also the age binaries are transcended, where children teach adults, you know, and they actually stand up in front, and the adults sit down with the rest of the other children and listen to these volunteers who come up front, like child volunteers who want to teach something that they know. So therefore, changing the roles, and I write about that as there's this scholar, Lugones, who talks about love. Loving, you know, is about also thinking of yourself as a child, an adult with a child in them, and also the child with an adult in them. So putting yourself in the child's feet, and being a child by playing, for example. We did a lot of play of games, Sarah, and being with the children and playing games. And so taking the child in us out, and then the children, you know, also teaching us new games. So for me, that form of teacher training is what's needed in terms of not seeing the teacher as not a knower, but seeing a teacher as knowing something, but also learning something from others in the literacy club, and then taking that into the classroom when they work with their own children in classrooms. But also I do teacher training at UCT. So my PGC students have been working with these strategies of designing multilingual lesson plans. Because you think about, okay, if we think about inclusion or inclusive education, how would you be inclusive in your literacy classroom? What would you need to think about? And then they have to think about the languages that the children speak in the classroom, but not only the languages, but the other ways of communication that children can be stronger in. Because some children are stronger in spoken language, like they can tell stories, but some children will be good at writing. Some children will be good at drawing, you know, and others will be good at performing stories when you do your dramas. So in so doing, you are actually tapping on each other, on each child's strengths, but while they also learn something that is not their strength in the literacy club. So my student teachers have had to bring these two together in their lesson planning for schooling. And I can see now they are working in schools where one started working in an English medium school, and then said it was difficult to bring in the multilingual aspects in that school, because it was like just English. But she changed schools and went to another school that is more diverse. And she said, Oli, your ideas that you brought in class, they're actually working here. I can see how I can use them here. So, but of course, we need to share these ideas across, like I'm doing now here. But of course, in many other spaces, we can talk about this, and also we can influence policy. This is why we've been critiquing the monolingualized frameworks for teaching reading, because they then tend to take away the idea that some children are multilingual. And so doing our critique there is also another way at a higher level to show that we need to broaden the way we see and conceptualize language. Yeah, so of course, these multiliteracies, for me, the multimodal literacies are a way to enrich children's literacy experiences. Because when you do the science of reading, the decoding and comprehension skills, classrooms become a bore. You are just saying the sounds and decoding the sounds of language, but you are not doing anything that is creative with the language. And so I think creativity for children who come from marginalized communities is being taken away from them, because then they can't work in creative ways with language and literacy. And yet we want creative writers at the end of the day. We want these creative writers, artists, and we need to show that an artist can communicate a story through the wordless book, but the children are also exposed to a lot of dramas on television, and the people on television are telling stories through action and movement and language, integrating all these modes of communication. And which is why we also take them to theater to experience a story in a different way. But the focus on book literacy takes away those other experiences that children can have. And we want to have all of them, not an either or situation.
Amani, would you like to also raise your question for Sis Polly as well? Thank you, Sis Polly.
All right, thanks, Sarah. So my question is around, so Sis Polly mentioned something very interesting, African multilingualism. And my question is around that, in how do we sort of mobilize varieties of African languages for teaching in the classroom? Because you really do see situations where you are in a classroom observing or doing whatever, and you see the teacher trying to reach the learners, but some of it just don't get what is being said because the language that is used in the school that is not the same dialect that they are familiar with. And so, I mean, she's articulated how that can happen, but I'm trying to think in terms of when it comes to assessment and writing and all those things, how do you, sorry. Yeah, sorry about that. But yeah, I don't know if that made sense.
I think I sort of understand it in terms of assessment, where we see that English is, a standard language is valued, right? Whether it's English or Xhosa or Sesotho or isiZulu, Tshivenda, that standard language is much more valued in assessments. But I would argue for assessments that give children, sections that you can answer this section using your non-standard repertoire. You could answer this section using the standard repertoire, the standard language, and you can use this section of the assessment where you do a translation. A lot of my work in this club, children did translation work, and translation work is not valued enough. In fact, translation skills and interpretation skills are not valued. And these are the skills that only multilingual people have, because they're able to translate from one language to another. And so giving an assessment of saying, okay, for 10 marks or for 15 marks, could you translate this piece of text to English or to isiXhosa? In that sense, you are also teaching the children language, because to be able to translate, you must have both languages, right? And you must have the skill, develop the skill of turning one language into another language. And that becomes a translation, a bilingual activity. So you could therefore legitimize use of different varieties and languages in assessment. For example, there's a poem in a book that Denise Newfield and the students that they were doing research on in Soweto together with Robert Mangetso. The book is called Tebua. They printed it. These students were doing high school and they were dropping out of school. and they were not coming to school enough. They were not attracted to English because they were like, you know what, we see people in the township getting rich, they don't have an education, we can also do that. And so they had an attitude to English. And so what Robert Mangetho did in that research, he allowed the students to write in their languages, to write poetry in their languages, and also asked them to start off with their clan names. And of course, the clan name is the closest thing to any child who is an African language speaker. A Black child will have this clan name. And of course, we proudly talk about our clan names like Ndingumamcina, you know. So doing ukuzituta and to write about yourself was a good start, to start from where the learner is. And he allowed them to write in other languages, even though he was a teacher of English in the class. And then later on, they brought in the urban varieties of English, or, you know, that mixed English and Sisuthu and isiZulu in their poetry. But this is not something that is strange. It's something that published authors like Sipho Spamla, for example, his poetry in 1985 is a mix of all that, and it's beautiful. It's like Tsotsi Tao, if you want to call it, and it's published. And so we need to then start giving value to these non-standardized varieties. If other authors have published in them, then those varieties are also as important. And also bringing in the dialects. You could allow the children, this is also something that I've been thinking about in terms of umhlobo wenene, that, you know, sometimes people who do not speak the standard variety, which of isiXhosa, let's say somebody who speaks isimpondo comes on radio and gets employed to be a broadcaster, there's always this outcry that this person doesn't speak good enough isiXhosa. We don't want this person on our radio station. But I think the radio station could be inclusive by having programs that are in isimpondo and isiHlubi and isiXhosa, you know. So in the same way with assessment, we can be as inclusive as that as well.
All right, thank you for that.
And also, I think, may I offer an experience there, what Xolisa's saying as well, because I know Amani's focuses on curriculum, and we know that whatever happens, the assessment backwashes. It backwashes into what the teacher focuses on. It backwashes into the choices of resources and texts. And of course, it shapes what gets the lion's share of the time that, you know, school will focus on. But I remember doing, I was teaching in the English department at a school where we did isiXhosa home language and English home language. And those, the Xhosa department and the English department said, okay, we're going to do isiBhongo, isiXhosa. We're going to do praise poetry in the oral assessment in the Xhosa curriculum for senior phase, grade 8, grade 9. Then in the English class, we made sure that we basically did curriculum planning together across the language departments. And then the task in the English class was to translate the isiBhongo that you'd researched at home with umakhulu wako or umalume wako. And most of the, I mean, we just got the most amazing response from these teenagers who were very sort of taciturn and not very excited about what was happening at school. As soon as we said, please go speak to your grandparents and learn your, you know, find out what is your praise poem for your family. And they're like, oh, I don't know. So they went home and they brought it back to the Xhosa class. And then in English, they had a crack at translating. And then we worked grammar, about how verbs work. We worked, you know, some of the formal curriculum aspects. But because the language departments were working together, and thinking about how we coordinated assessments together, we could still cross-reference what the students were bringing to class. So even within the existing frameworks, it was a hell of a lot of work, but you can even find spaces there to get creative. So I just thought I would add that as well, relating the formal curriculum and assessment question to what Sis Xolisa is saying.
I suppose, sorry, if I could, yeah, can I?
Okay, I wanted to add to what Sarah is saying in terms of the maths and science. Now imagine a grade 4 child who's been taught in isiXhosa or isiZulu or Tshivenda in the foundation phase. Suddenly they have to switch to English medium and they must do everything in English. And they have big textbooks. They haven't learned English enough to even write in it, because writing is not seen as part of as an important part of literacy. Now they must do it in English, and then they struggle there. So imagine therefore using the 2 languages to assess the children and what would come out of that.
Yeah. So I suppose the concern for me as well was the question of getting a sort of a baseline of what learners can already do, because if you are going to teach, then you need to have some sense of what languages do they know and to what capacity do they know those languages. And so for sort of in a systemic view of the education landscape, I mean, is there a place for such baseline, systematic, standardized assessments in that kind of framework? Because then it becomes difficult to think about curriculum if, I don't know, if you don't have like an understanding of the learners that are in the system and what they can do and how to improve from there.
You know, the only thing that they do is the forms that children fill in when they start at school, and the form will say, what is your home language? Now, you will realize that for some children, the home language is not the language of the parents. But they will write the language of the parents. They will say it is isiXhosa. I don't consider my children monolingual isiXhosa. They went to crash very early on in life, and so they were becoming English and isiXhosa at the same time. But that one question that asks the children to state the home language actually forces them to be monolingual, because it's not opened up to ask, what are the languages that you speak at home? It says one language, and there's little space to fit in other languages. And I used to write for them to say bilingual isiXhosa English speakers. And in my house, we also have isiNdebele, we have isiZulu, we have Setswana. In this house where I stayed with my cousins who spoke Setswana and isiZulu. In fact, all my cousins, you know, they grew up in the Eastern Cape and they went to Limpopo and they learned isiZulu as home language, and they learned isiNdebele as home language, but they are also like Xhosa by ethnicity. So which one is going to be the home language now of those children, you know, when they have been exposed to all these languages? So it's something that we need to think about. So that question of a baseline is actually important to do it in terms of the languages spoken in the community, languages spoken in the homes, not just one language, because then we make assumptions that the children are monolingual. And just in a recent article that I read, that Baba Lwayashe and Caroline Makinu have written, in fact, it's a book chapter. They talk about how the parents say the children are Xhosa, but the children have been raised in an urban setting where they speak English mostly all their life. They go to an English medium school, a model C school. They do have some isiXhosa resources, but they are very little compared to the English resources. But the father will say, of course, I'm Xhosa, so they are Xhosa. But the language use of the children is not isiXhosa per se. So we have those things that would need to be taken into account.
Yeah, all right. Thanks, Ascoli. Thanks, Sarah.
Precious? Sorry, Gijima's joined the conversation.
Hello. Nyebo Ascoli, I think your talk was very, very insightful. There is a point I want to make, and then a question that I'm going to pose to you. And the point being, for me, as somebody who teaches at university level, the issues of language and translanguaging particularly are also very pertinent. As much as we talk about them at the lower levels of education, I think even at university, they are very important for us to take into consideration. Just the other day, we were reflecting with a colleague of mine in terms of assessments, because we assess in the form of essays, for example. And essays, there's a particular skill that you need in order to write an essay. And this skill is something that students have to have mastered from around about grade 5 or 6, building up to university level. So if the student has not mastered that skill, it becomes a cultural asset that either you have it or you don't. And if you don't, you struggle with university. And it comes from the way that we use language. People who have been taught in, especially who go through English medium schools, for example, master the skill because English is spoken as much as it is written. But students who come from schools where English is not the main language, you find that the mode of teaching is mostly oral. And so they learn to conceptualize through the oral, right? And so now that student, for us to then assess them in a particular way, through essays and so forth, I think then there is a disjuncture between what they know and what they can express. And the system obviously tells you if you fail an essay, then you're not managing the content, you know. And one of the conversations that I've been having with some of my honor students is to sit them down and say, I know you understand cognitively, this mark that I've given you is not a mark of your cognition. I'm just saying you're not expressing your points very well. So finding, then using language in different ways and in different formats, I think is something that we need to talk about at university level as well. The question that I wanted to ask is, you talk about translanguaging as creating a third space, you know, where we create that which is not yet named, right? It's neither this language or that language, but it's a fluid space, right? My question, way that our institutions from education, how they are structured, how then do we, because always they're geared towards mastering the language. If translanguaging is creating something that is not yet named, then how do we justify this new space if we don't yet have its confines? Because education is geared towards mastering something. You know what I mean? How do we manage that? How do we justify that in the conversations that we have with department bureaucrats and technocrats and so forth? How do we, because we know as social scientists, we know the importance of this work that you're doing and how revolutionary it is. But then how do we package it in a way that we can make sense to technocrats to say, okay, this is a fluid space that we are creating. It's not yet named, and part of its value is in its fluidity. How then do we package it? I don't know if that question is making sense to you.
Yes, I think it's making a lot of sense. And I like to think about it in ways that Hilary Jenks, you know, she created a model for critical literacy pedagogy. And she, in this model, she has also 4 quadrants, like the 4 resources model that I was talking about, where she has, she says, we have to talk to our students about issues of access. So you want to give them access to the valued varieties of language, or the named languages that are valued, right? So the language like that we talk about, Precious, could be English and also standard English. So you need to give access to the students there. you also need to talk about issues of dominance, because we cannot just accept issues of standardized languages and monolingual languages or Anglo-normative, Anglo-normativity. You cannot just, accept that without talking about issues of power and dominance. So the other quadrant talks to dominance and the other quadrant talks to access. The other quadrant talks to diversity. And this diversity talks to this space that you're talking about, the fluid space that is not named. So you want to take into account issues of diversity, inclusion, and issues of building from existing knowledges that are not recognized in our education system and bringing them to the fore. So you need to attend to that. And then the final space is, the final quadrant is that of transformative practice. So once you've done with your students and have spoken about the dominance of English or Afrikaans, and then talked about why these languages are valued, and how do we make our students and give access to them, to these languages, instead of denying them access to these languages, and what the consequences are there for doing that. But also saying we need to bring diversity as well in the space. So we can't just, in the name of access, then marginalize everything else. We need to attend to diversity, and then we need to transform our pedagogy. So how do we then transform our pedagogy after considering those issues, especially the first three: access, dominance, and diversity? Then transforming could be whatever word you use for it, whether it is decolonization or something, but you have to, name it in that sense. So, for example, we could talk about, hey, how do you delink from coloniality? So delinking means paying attention to that diversity and saying, pluriversalism from Mignolo, who talks about, decoloniality, pays attention to pluriversality, but also dealings from these other ideologies that are Eurocentric, that are also valuing all the Eurocentric knowledges and stuff. So I think people will name them differently as transformative approaches, and some will say decolonial approaches, depending on what it is that is decolonial in that diverse space that you are bringing. So this is how I can talk about it. We have written a chapter also for to show what we tried doing in higher education with our own students in our classrooms, where we use the linguistic resources. I do understand that many of our students can speak African languages but struggle to write them because of the schooling system that didn't allow them to conceptualize or even to write in the languages. So we need to find other ways of assessing the students that are not written. So you need to balance your assessment between essays and other forms of assessment. I know that some time ago at UWC, they used to have oral assessment, so you could have a percentage of what your oral assessment accounts for, and also what your multimodal assessment would account for, and what your written assessment would account for the range, if you wanted to try out different assessments. Otherwise, then you are, this is the question in academic literacies, that we also challenge academic literacies for focusing on written language and standardized language and monolingualized languages at university level. So for my honors students, for example, there's an assessment where they had to write it bilingually. And when the students didn't write bilingually, so I asked them, in another assignment, I asked them to reflect on their writing processes for the 3 other assignments, to reflect on the process of academic writing and assessment. And they made, some made good points about how they missed an opportunity to write in African languages when they were given an opportunity to do so. But they also spoke to their own insecurities of not being used to writing in African languages, and this being the only course that has allowed them to, to write in their languages. So of course, the reflections varied because some students did actually write part one of the assignment in English and part one in their languages and part two in English. So you could also do that in assessment. And it was different genres too. So the part one of the genre was not necessarily academic language in the sense that we know it. It was more of a memoir, like a kind of genre that they had to use for that. And they had to write about their literacy histories. And so memories of their literacy history and who read to them in what language and how this has contributed to the people that they are today as readers and writers. So that's a different format, right? That part one, but part two was a little bit more academic. So they had to write about academic concepts. So combining the genres is also another way, in my view, to give student access to diversity, to diversify your pedagogy.
I'm sorry to come in. I'm very conscientious of time. It is almost 6:10. Sorry, Precious.
No, that's good.
No.
I came in, unfortunately, I came in a little late. I would have really loved to engage with you from the very get-go, but I will definitely get your details from Sarah and we can have a conversation around it, especially around the issue of
Yes.
how do we allow our students, give them different opportunities to engage with the content from different language epochs. And we do know our students have diverse backgrounds. So you've given me a bit to talk about, but I will reach out. Definitely, I will reach out. I would love to learn from some of your experience with your own students.
We must definitely do that. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Polly, and for everyone who made the time to come and listen. This is just getting started. This is one of our first I think our second, hey Precious, this is our second E-SIG gathering.
This is our second, yeah.
But I'm hoping that we're going to kind of spread the word about it. Polly, this takes me back to the days of Education Fish Tank back in 2011 when you and Nadima were the first to come and talk to Fish Tank. Do you remember? Way back then in Rondebosch when David Jeffrey first started.
I remember.
This is history rhyming, I wonder, you know. Hopefully though, we will keep this space a little bit more open and with a little more momentum as we move forward. So thank you so much. Siyabulela kakhulu, Sis Polly, Dr. Guzula, for your time and your energy and your love and your knowledge today. Thank you so much.
I can't wait to graduate.
I want to see that silly red hat on your head. I want to see umwazi obomvu.
Oh my goodness.
You're gonna look, I'm sorry, everyone looks terrible in that hat.
And I always say hats don't suit me. I never put any duke or hat, but I will see.
I don't know. I've seen you with the duke. I think you look quite nice, but no one looks good in the red mushroom PhD hat. I think it's a signal that you have become so accomplished that you can put on a silly hat and people still respect you.
And people just don't care.
Thank you so much, everybody, Onatolo, and those who didn't come and sort of necessarily sort of want to speak up. We're still grateful you came today. Be safe, everyone. Take care of yourself. And thank you so much. Till the next one.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Precious. I would love to continue having conversations with you.
Definitely will do. Okay.
Bye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
very